In one of the old districts of the city, among quiet streets, stood a house with a long abandoned garden. It was surrounded by dense trees that seemed to hang over it, hiding it from prying eyes. Inside this house, among many forgotten items, there lived an old toy. It had been gathering dust in the attic, among cobwebs and old books, for many years. The toy was a seemingly ordinary stuffed bear, except its eyes were strangely bright, almost alive. The house belonged to the Johnson family, who had recently bought it. The parents, Emily and Mark, dreamed of a peaceful life away from the noise and hustle of the city. Along with them, their son, 6-year-old David, moved into the house. The boy was curious and brave, but even he found the house a bit strange. On the first evening, he noticed that strange rustling sometimes echoed through the house, and drafts swept through the rooms, even though all the windows and doors were closed. Weeks passed, and David gradually got used to the new place. He often played in the garden, ran through the corridors of the old house, and explored every room. One day, when his parents were busy with their own things, David decided to go up to the attic. The staircase leading up was narrow and creaked under his light steps. When he opened the heavy wooden door, he was met by a wave of stale air and thick dust. David coughed but resolutely stepped inside. The attic was dark and gloomy. Only a faint light filtering through a small window allowed him to see the old furniture, scattered books, and boxes. David slowly walked around the room, examining everything around him. Suddenly, he noticed something on a shelf that caught his attention. It was a stuffed bear sitting among other toys, but something about it immediately seemed odd to David. The bear was covered in dust, but its eyes gleamed as if new, and they seemed to follow the boy's every move. David approached closer and cautiously picked up the bear. The toy was heavy, as if something was hidden inside. The boy carefully examined it but found nothing unusual. Deciding it was just an old toy, David took it downstairs with him. Once back in his room, he placed the bear on a shelf with his other toys, unaware that by doing so, he had awakened something terrifying. That evening, David went to bed as usual. His parents wished him good night, and the house fell into silence. But as soon as the boy closed his eyes, strange things began to happen in his room. At first, he heard a faint rustling, as if something was moving around. David opened his eyes but saw nothing out of the ordinary. He thought it was just his imagination and tried to fall asleep again. However, the rustling continued. Soon it was accompanied by soft, barely audible footsteps, as if someone small was walking around the room. David felt a chill of fear run down his spine. He tried to get up, but something inside him wouldn't let him move. With difficulty, he caught his breath, turned on his side, and saw that the bear he had brought from the attic was now sitting not on the shelf but right by his bed. The bear sat there, its face turned towards David, and its eyes seemed to shine even brighter in the darkness. The boy felt his heart race and a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't believe the toy could move on its own. David forced himself to sit up in bed and reach out to the bear, intending to put it back on the shelf. But as soon as his fingers touched the plush fur, he felt the bear twitch. Startled by this movement, David jumped back and fell to the floor. However, the toy didn't move any further. It continued to sit as if nothing had happened. The boy thought it was just a dream and tried to convince himself that it was all just his imagination. But when he looked at the bear again, he noticed that one of its eyes blinked. David felt a cold wave of fear wash over him, chilling him to the bone. The next morning, David told his parents what had happened. However, they just laughed and reassured him, saying that it was just childish fears and that he had probably let his imagination run wild. Mark, David's father, even went up to his room to show him that there was nothing to be afraid of. The bear seemed to be just an ordinary toy again, with no signs of the previous night's activity. The parents left it on the shelf and left the room, leaving David feeling misunderstood. During the day, everything seemed fine. David played with his other toys, drew pictures, and read books. But every time his gaze accidentally fell on the bear, he felt a surge of fear inside him. The toy no longer seemed ordinary. David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even when he turned away. But the strangest thing was that the longer he looked at the bear, the more it seemed to change its position, even though he hadn't touched it. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, trying not to look in the direction of the shelf where the bear was. But curiosity and fear got the better of him. He slowly turned his head and saw that the bear was sitting by his bed again. This time, David couldn't just ignore it. He jumped out of bed and ran to his parents, shouting that the bear had moved again. Emily and Mark, concerned about their son's state, came to his room. But when they entered, the bear was back on the shelf, motionless as before. The parents calmed David, put him back to bed, and decided to take him to a doctor the next morning, thinking it was just his imagination. That night, David once again felt someone's gaze on him. He opened his eyes and saw that the bear was no longer sitting by his bed. David shuddered and looked around the room, but the toy was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound like a door creaking. David looked at the door leading to the hallway and saw the bear slowly stepping out through it. This was the last straw. David jumped out of bed, ran after the toy, and grabbed it. But as soon as he touched the bear, he felt his hand stick to the plush fur, as if glued. The toy began to tremble, and then suddenly its mouth opened, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth. David screamed, and his parents rushed into the room. They saw their son struggling to shake off the bear, which was now clearly moving on its own. Mark dashed to David and forcefully tore the bear from his hand. The toy fell to the floor, and for a moment it seemed like it was over. But then the bear suddenly began to move again, crawling across the floor and making strange noises. Emily screamed, and Mark angrily stomped on the toy, but it kept moving as if it were alive. David cried, begging his parents to get rid of the cursed toy. In desperation, Mark grabbed the bear and ran downstairs to the basement. There, in the far corner, he found an old trunk they had yet to unpack. He threw the bear inside and slammed the lid shut. He then wrapped it with chains and placed a heavy box on top. All this time, the bear continued making strange noises, but soon they faded away. Mark returned upstairs where Emily and David were waiting. The boy was terrified, but his parents tried to comfort him. The next morning, David was quiet and thoughtful. He couldn't forget the terrible night and the bear that had come to life before his eyes. His parents decided not to bring up the subject again and hoped that, in time, everything would be forgotten. But deep down, each of them knew that this was not just a child's fear. The bear that had come to life was something far more sinister than they could have imagined. A few days passed, and life in the house seemed to return to normal. But David increasingly felt strange eyes on him, even when he was alone in a room. He tried not to think about it, and not to remember the bear. However, one night he heard the familiar rustling again. David's heart raced, and he recalled the eerie sound the toy had made. He closed his eyes and pulled the blanket over his head, trying to hide from the terror. The next morning, Emily discovered that the door to the basement was open. She didn't think much of it, assuming someone had forgotten to close it. However, a growing sense of unease began to take hold of her. Mark also noticed that some things in the house were out of place, but he chalked it up to his forgetfulness. They both tried not to talk about it out loud to avoid scaring David. That night, David heard the rustling again. It was louder and clearer now. The boy knew that the bear had escaped from its confinement. He was afraid to get out of bed, but knew that if he didn't, things would only get worse. Slowly, he got up and, trying not to make a sound, approached the door. The bear was standing on the threshold. It swayed slightly, its eyes glowing once again with that terrifying light. David wanted to scream, but fear silenced him. The bear seemed to sense his fear and slowly moved closer. With each step, it grew larger, its paws stretching out, and its fur becoming coarser and darker. David began to back away until he hit the wall behind him. The bear loomed over him, and its eyes now burned like two fiery orbs. At that moment, the door to the room burst open, and Mark and Emily appeared on the threshold. They saw the bear towering over David, ready to attack. Mark rushed forward, grabbed the toy, and struggling with it, tried to throw it out the window. But the bear, as if possessing its own will, clung to him, biting and scratching. Finally, Mark managed to break free and tossed the bear outside. It was dark and quiet outside. The bear fell to the ground, and its eyes immediately went dark. Mark and Emily watched it from the window, not believing what they were seeing. David was in shock and couldn't utter a word. The toy that had just tried to kill him now lay motionless, as if nothing had happened, but none of them dared to go outside to make sure it was really over. The next day passed in anxious anticipation. Mark decided that they needed to get rid of the bear once and for all. He grabbed a large sack, went outside, and carefully picked up the toy. The bear was cold and once again seemed like an ordinary stuffed toy. Mark tossed it into the sack, locked it, and took it to the dump. He threw the sack into the deepest pit and made sure it was buried under trash and dirt. When he returned home, Mark told Emily and David what he had done. They breathed a sigh of relief, hoping the nightmare was finally over. David began playing in his room again, but now the bear was no longer on the shelf. He no longer felt the strange eyes on him or heard any sounds, and life in the house returned to normal. However, the boy still felt uneasy inside. He couldn't forget what had happened. Weeks passed, and David gradually began to forget the horrors he had experienced. His parents tried not to remind him of the bear, and life went on. However, one day when David was home alone, he heard the familiar rustling again. His heart stopped. The boy slowly left his room and walked down the hallway, listening to every sound. He approached the door leading to the basement and heard something moving behind it. David held his breath and cautiously opened the door. Standing on the threshold was the bear. It looked exactly as it had before, with burning eyes and a terrifying appearance. David wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The bear slowly raised its paw and took a step forward. David screamed in fear and bolted. At that moment, the doors in the house began to slam shut on their own, and the windows started to crack and shatter. The house seemed to come to life, and strange things began to happen inside. Furniture moved, doors creaked, and a strange smell of dampness and mold filled the air. David tried to escape, but the doors were locked, and he was overcome with true terror. When the parents returned home, they found David huddled in the corner of his room, trembling with fear. The house was in disarray, as if a hurricane had passed through it. The boy kept repeating the same phrase, "He's back." Mark and Emily couldn't understand what their son was talking about until they noticed that the basement door was open again, and inside lay the bear, as if its nighttime adventure to the dump had never happened. The parents decided they could no longer stay in the house. They quickly packed their things and moved in with relatives, leaving the house behind. The bear remained in the basement, but its eyes began to glow again in the dark. The house gradually fell into disrepair, but none of the neighbors ever saw the Johnsons again. It is said that at night, strange rustlings and footsteps can still be heard in that house, and sometimes a strange light can be seen from the windows. The new owner of the house, who bought it many years later, found an old trunk in the attic. When he opened it, he discovered many old toys inside, including the bear with the glowing eyes. The owner decided to keep it, unaware that he had once again awakened the horror that should have remained forever locked within the walls of that house.